So we're about to head out on a little hike through Fort Yarghow State Park in Georgia. And we're going to take a look at some plants and trees along the way that are useful plants, not just edibles, but useful in some way that are of interest to us in the survival and bushcraft community. Hope you stay tuned. I just found some jewelweed, which is near a creek. It always grows near water. And if you look at the shape of the leaf and the stems, which are succulent and semi-translucent, it's usually not hard to identify jewelweed. And at some point in the summer, you should be seeing the little orange flowers, which look like jewels. But this plant is useful for stopping itches and rashes, and it can counteract poison ivy if you crush up the leaves and stems. It contains a lot of juice. It has to be fresh. You can't store it and expect it to work nearly as well. So that is jewelweed. I found some curly dock, or curled dock, which, as you can tell, has the curled leaves. And the other identifying characteristics are the stem has lines in it, and there's usually a paper sheath at the base of the stems. So, curly dock, which is useful for treating rashes and stings. Here's a good example of a sassafras tree. Note the unique shape of the leaves and the fact that the leaves have three relatively distinct shapes. Got the rounded, you got the mitten or the glove, and there should be the mitten leaves also you will often see with a lobe on only one side rather than on both sides. The bark is unique, green and woody, and the root bark tea is medicinal. It used to be used for root beer. There's a long story about why it was later banned, but fact is it can be used as a medicinal. The root bark tea can be used to kill microbes in your stomach, which can be useful if you get sick from drinking water that may have giardia or other microbes in it. Not something you want to drink on a regular basis, simply because it also kills the good microbes. But in an emergency, it's a very useful plant to know. Sassafras. Here we have kudzu, which can be a useful plant. Very common in Georgia. It's got three leaves and it's a vine like poison ivy, but leaves are typically larger and have a slightly different shape, although they can be confused. So how is this useful? The new growth tips, a lot of times they'll curl in a cork fashion, but this new growth is edible. Well, the whole plant's edible, but the new growth is tasty. I think something like green beans. And also, the vines themselves can be used as a form of cordage. Not the best, not the worst. But kudzu, very common. In fact, it's an invasive, but it is an edible. So look it up. Pull it up. It's invasive. Grows all over. If it gets into your property, It can grow feet in a day and hard to get rid of. Kudzu. It's what's for lunch. Here's a mullein plant, a medicinal plant that can be used, number one, for toilet paper. The leaves are real fuzzy and soft. And number two, a tea can be made with the leaves, which helps with breathing problems, respiratory, and other maladies associated with a cold. The stem, once dried in the fall, makes a good hand drill spindle as well. Mullein. Here is greenbrier. It's very common. It grows everywhere. Has other names like catbrier, but it is the only plant, at least the only plant I'm aware of, which has both these tendrils that wrap around everything and the thorns. Now, this entire plant is edible, and it's a good trail edible if you pick the soft, new growth tips. And a good trail nibble. There's a bunch of it around here, pretty much a bunch of it around everywhere. It is essentially a vine that I like to call nature's barbed wire, because it's actually got a very tough stem. And if you take the back of your knife and knock off these thorns, you will have a good piece of what can be used as cordage, or what they call a withy, kind of like straps. You know, it's not quite as flexible as cordage, so but it can be very useful. It's very strong. Here's some more of that new growth that can be tasty, especially early in the spring. That is greenbrier. Okay, here we have muscadine vines. Muscadines are a type of grape, and they develop a fruit called muscadines. And when ripe, they are purplish. It's late July, and it's a little early for the fruit to be ripe just yet, but that's a great edible. Of course, the grape leaves, which can be used for cooking. The other use for grapevines or muscadine vines would be number one, cordage, but also the larger vines can hold a lot of water. Here's a larger part of the vine, and it goes all the way to the ground. You can see how big these vines can get. And especially in the spring when the sap is running, these vines contain a lot of water. It could be a great source of survival water at the right time of year. There are videos on that, and the technique for getting water from them, which basically involves cutting it low, severing it through, and then reaching up high and cutting a notch, which allows the free flow of water to the severed end, and that will drain the water into a container, and you can just drink it. Great source of fresh, pure water. There are these little air roots which can be used as a fashion of cordage as well, but not super strong, but you weave a few of them together and you got something you can use for cordage. So, good plant to know about, muscadine. I found some more jewel weed, and it actually has the flowers on it. You can see those orange flowers that hang beneath and sort of resemble jewels. We're near water, which is where jewelweed grows. So you can see the stems and the leaves. Jewelweed. And here we have the tulip magnolia tree. It's commonly known as tulip poplar, but it has no relation to the poplar family and actually belongs to the magnolia family. You can see the leaf is shaped like a tulip, which is a unique shape. And let's take a look at the trunk, which is grayish and usually mottled with white. This tree is very important as a useful plant because the bark can be used for many things. In the right state, you can use the bark for making containers or shingles for a shelter or cordage, or when it's fully decomposed as tinder. So, very useful tree. The wood is light. It's heavy because it contains a lot of water when it's live, but when it's dried out, it's a lighter, softer wood, and also useful for making bow drill sets. So that is your tulip magnolia tree. Here we have the yucca plant, the eastern yucca that is, not to be confused with the western yucca. The eastern version is YUCA, the western version is YUCCA, and the reason they shouldn't be confused is because the western yucca root is edible, whereas the eastern variety is not. The reason that this plant is good to know about is that the fibers in the yucca leaves are very strong, one of the strongest in nature, and make excellent cordage. When you get rid of the green stuff and just process the fibers, you have some very strong cordage that can even be used as a bowstring, and was used by the Native Americans, the Cherokees in this area, for bowstrings. So that is the eastern yucca. Here we have broadleaf plantain, a very useful plant and easy to identify. The broadleaf version, as opposed to the narrowleaf, has this long seed head. These are edible. The whole plant is edible. And the way you identify this positively, you see the leaves originate from a rosette, and you'll notice that the leaves have these parallel veins. So that makes it fairly easy to identify. The narrowleaf plantain also has similar properties for medicinal and edible use, but the broadleaf can be easier to use when you use it as a poultice. So the medicinal use would be to treat insect stings or to help heal wounds. It promotes new cell growth, and Very useful for rashes, stings, abrasions. So a good plant to know about. It's also very nutritious as an edible. So that is broadleaf plantain, not to be confused with the plantain tree bearing the plantain banana-like fruit. It's an entirely different species. This particular one's Latin name is Plantago major. So that's broadleaf plantain. So I'm at the end of my hike at Fort Yargo State Park, where we talked about various plants and trees. Please look at the links in the description, because there are plants or trees that we didn't encounter or talk about that are good to know about. So hope you enjoyed the video. Todd out.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to be notified of new videos, click the notification bell.